Despite differences such as the experience of the Spanish flu pandemic, advances in medicine, and developing global cooperation, it holds valuable lessons in fighting the coronavirus epidemic even 100 years later. In the first 6 months of the epidemic, which began in March 1918, it spread around the world due to the lack of understanding of its severity. The August-December measures brought the outbreak under control. However, in countries where measures were untimely relaxed, the virus respread in a third wave, killing thousands of people and continuing until 1920. Although it is called the Spanish flu, the first recorded case in history occurs in Kansas in the United States on March 4, 1918. At Camp Houston, the cook goes to the infirmary complaining of a fever, headache and cough. In the following 3 weeks, 1,100 soldiers in this camp are hospitalized, and thousands of soldiers are suffering from the disease.
The disease is spreading rapidly in France, Britain, Italy and Spain, where World War I battles continue in Europe.
In the spring of 1918, 3/4 of French troops and more than half of British soldiers suffered from the flu. In May, the flu is seen in North Africa, then in Bombay, India, China in June, first cases reported in Australia in July. But during this period, which is called the first wave, the symptoms of the disease are mild and the duration is short, and the mortality rate is not very different from normal season flu. By August, the Spanish flu is resurfacing as a deadly second wave. The United States is respreading through European and African ports, and then through military mobility within Europe. This second wave, which continues for close to 6 weeks, spreads to North America, Central and South America, Western and Southern Africa in September, and a significant part of Europe. From here it reaches Russia and through it into the north of Asia, leading to a second wave in China in November. The fact that the disease led to a large number of deaths led to strict quarantine, hygiene, and monitoring measures in many countries, and by December 1918, the flu epidemic in almost all of the world seemed to have stopped. As the Southern Hemisphere experienced summer, when Australia abolished quarantine measures in 1919, the epidemic revives and spreads from here to the world again. At the end of January, New York and Paris, where post-war negotiations are continuing, are again beginning to grapple with the epidemic. Although fewer people get sick during this last wave, the disease is observed to be equally fatal. In May 1919, it was declared that the full pandemic had ended, and with the relaxation of measures, the epidemic began again in Japan, and lasted until 1920. The Spanish flu also affected different age groups, such as COVID-19, but its most deadly effects were seen on children and the elderly. The prevalence of the disease, and the extent of its lethality were not fully understood, due to the refusal of governments in many wartime countries to disclose the number of deaths and cases. It was fully identified in 1930, when the Spanish flu was caused by a virus, and the first virus to be decomposed in a laboratory setting was found in 1933. The reason why the name of the disease remains Spanish flu is that Spain is one of the few countries that freely announce news about the pandemic in the press, since it remained neutral in the First World War. On the front pages of the newspapers, the names of those who died in the outbreak were announced in lists. For this reason, in many parts of the world, it was assumed that the disease began in Spain. As with the coronavirus outbreak, in the Spanish flu pandemic, the key to stopping the outbreak was strict implementation of preventive measures in an environment where there was no vaccine and no known treatment. The first official measures against the pandemic began to be implemented in August 1918, 6 months after the onset of the disease. In many European countries, suspicious cases have been reported, and schools, boarding schools, and barracks have been put under observation. By October, many countries in Europe had thoroughly tightened these measures, and added new ones. Public places were closed, meetings were banned. In many countries, Sunday rites in churches were either banned or restricted to very short periods. Public transport, shops, and crowds gathered around it were disrupted. Streets and public spaces such as workshops, theaters and cinemas, churches began to be disinfected. Health officials began distributing free soap and clean water to those whose economic situation was worse, rigorously cleaning human waste and garbage. Food products were inspected, spitting on the streets was banned, and handouts describing the healing effects of water were distributed. A pandemic that has killed millions of people around the world for close to 2 years has left many valuable lessons for today's world, which is facing new viruses. The effects of strategies such as health education, isolation, hygiene, case monitoring on preventing the spread of flu, are always among these lessons. The fact that the Spanish flu can continue in waves for 2 years shows the heavy cost of loosening these measures prematurely. So we have to know history and learn a lesson. In this way, we can build the future more firmly without repeating the mistakes made in the past. For example, we need to make an intervention plan as soon as possible for the forests that are now being destroyed and the creatures that are being slaughtered. Or, we'll have no future to know history.